Hello. Um, I am going to do another video on underrated artists. Um, the one I'm going to do today is someone who, at various points in his career, was extremely famous, but is still considered sort of a cult figure by a lot of people. The man in question is Mr. Lee Hazlewood. Um, Lee Hazlewood was a songwriter, producer, artist in his own right, but is very much his own genre of music. You can't really pin down what Lee did. He kind of did a bit of everything. Um, Lee Hazlewood started off in the, I believe, mid 50s as a disc jockey in Texas, where he was from. And he famously was the first person in Texas, disc jockey wise, to play Mr. Elvis Presley on the radio. Um, Lee apparently was very popular. He did very well for himself, and as a lot of uh, radio stations do, they had musicians on their program, and one of them was Mr. Dwayne Eddy, who he then struck up a friendship with and um, recorded and produced, co-wrote his big hits, including Rebel Rouser, which is a standard early rock and roll instrumental tune. Off of the success of that and a couple of other people that he mentored, produced, etc., he got signed as an artist and did a couple of singles before making his first proper album, Trouble is a Lonesome Town, in 1963. It's very much a sort of story concept album. It's a town called Trouble and all the people who live in the town. Um, it's each song starts with the little sort of precursor about who the person is that the song is sort of supposed to be about. Um, and Lee had all of the Wrecking Crew, the big session musicians at the time, playing on it, and it's just very simple, kind of country flavored songs, all with Lee's distinct baritone singing style. He continued the trend with his next album, NSVIP, which is Not So Very Important People. It's very similar. It's very much in the same vein, except it's just each song vaguely has to do with all these different characters. It's not a great album. It does have some good songs on it. You do see it because there's not really much of a thread. It seems sort of random and weird in places, but there are some very good songs on it. And Lee you could hear him really finding himself as a songwriter. The next record he made is Friday's Child, which is much more of a straight sort of singer-songwriter album. Had a couple of songs that he had written that other people had hits with at the time, including his big protege at the time, Sanford Clark, with songs like "The Fool" and "Friday's Child" and "Houston," which I believe were all moderate hits at the time. These were all under Reprise Records. He then got signed to MGM in 1965 and began making albums. The two albums, Hazelwoodism, Its Cause and Cure, which I believe this is this cover here, and The Very Special World of Lee Hazlewood came out in 1965 and 1966, and have early versions. The predominant, by this point, Lee was really writing very strongly and become a very solid songwriter. It was around this time, and there's also some versions of some of the songs on these two albums, which got him in the attention of Mr. Frank Sinatra, who hired Lee to work with his daughter, Nancy, to make her solo career off the ground. So Lee ended up becoming her her writing her songs and producing her records, including the classic "These Boots Are Made for Walkin'" and "Sugar Town" and "Summer Wine" and "Some Velvet Morning," and most of her hits. I think like 2/3 of this CD is written, like 80% of this record is written by him and produced. And they also did a duet album about the same time called Nancy and Lee, which is one of the classic duet records. And, classic 60s stuff. Because of the success of the Nancy Sinatra records, Lee became very in demand as all of those things: songwriter, producer, etc. And he went back and made an album with MGM called Something Special, which was only released in certain markets in like Germany at the time, which is a very strange sort of, it sounds kind of like a, this is the cover of it, by the way, this one here, almost like you could hear it, imagine it in a lounge, like a lounge singer doing it, except it has all this weird scat singing on top of it, which is very strange. Some very interesting stuff on that record. But because of the success of these records, and she became one of the biggest stars of that period, Lee was given the opportunity and signed a deal to have his own record label called Lee Hazlewood Industries. This is a box set that Light in the Attic, a great record label, reissued. It's an amazing box set where they went through, and basically it's like a best of the record label. And through the late 60s into the early 70s, he released albums on this and had various people on the label, including early Graham Parsons before he joined the Byrds, his International Submarine Band before they were signed, and they made an album for them. I believe before he started releasing albums of his own on this label, he released the classic Love and Other Crimes album, which is one of his best, hands down, albums. Morning Dew, She Comes Running, Rosacoke Street, She's Funny That Way, The House Song. It's just, it's one of his very best albums, and was him at the height of his powers, just delivering, just the right project at the right time. It is considered probably the most well-known of his solo albums. He then went into making records under the LHI label. The first was Cowboy and the Lady, which was a duet album with him and Anne Margaret, who was a famous, popular singer and actress at the time. Still see her pop up and stuff occasionally, but she did this very country flavor, which you can tell by the cover, record. Lee then made another solo album called 40, because he made it around the time he turned 40. And then he came back, and his last two records under the label were Cowboy in Sweden, which he made in Sweden. He became I believe he moved there and became very close with a director who made like a sort of film slash sort of bunch of promotional clips for the album, which is actually a bonus with this box set. Has the DVD with it, which is pretty cool. And one of his last classic albums, Requiem for an Almost Lady, which is considered one of the definitive breakup albums of all time, which he made about his then ex-wife, which he had just recently broken up with, Susie Jane Holcomb, who ran the label with him. So around the early 70s, the label folded after not really getting much traction. Didn't really have any big hits on the label. And so basically Lee went and started doing stuff on his own, just sort of, and for the next 25, 30 years, he did whatever he wanted, mostly from Sweden. I have a couple of his records. 13 was, I think, the first record he released after, and it's got some, it was mid to late 70s. I think it's 73, I think it came out. I believe it was his 13th album, therefore the 13th. And then House Safe for Tigers in 1975, which is also a film connected with Somewhere Out There. He made another album called Moving On, which I don't have, and a couple of others. Made some sporadic into the early 80s, and then I believe he didn't really make any records until much later in like the 90s, early 2000s, when he got sick. I believe he got cancer, I don't remember what kind, and died in his mid-60s. He was rather old. As you can imagine, starting off as a disc jockey, he had several years. He was a little bit older. He was in his early 30s when he got started. Said he was turned 40 during the making of 40, which was like 69, 70. So you do the math. Very interesting, very unique singer-songwriter. There's numerous fans in all different genres, and just a very unique individual who has a very distinct place in a lot of people's hearts and in the memories of those who worked with him. Yeah, very much someone to look into, and almost sort of his own thing. It is a somewhat acquired taste because of Lee's individuality in his music, but it's definitely worth checking out. And the various Light in the Attic projects, which they have released since. The Light in the Attic, the label, has reissued a bunch of his albums, most of which I've shown here, and a couple of records on the Light in the Attic label as their collections outside of the box set that I showed you, which are all very interesting and very good. So thank you, and I will see you all again.